All right. Hello. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on Wednesday. I had to kind of do a little bit of rescheduling for some important personal business tomorrow night. So I appreciate everybody being here on a Wednesday as opposed to a Thursday. We will be back on Thursday next week. That was just kind of a temporary thing. So this is our one, two, three, four, maybe fifth. Is that right? Fifth broadcast of the year. Appreciate you all being here. So first of all, let me start by mentioning that there were a few questions that were asked last time, I guess, in the comments section of the chat bar that somehow I did not see. So I didn't get a chance to answer those. So one of them was about kind of what types of agriculture questions get asked in terms of free response questions on the test or have been. So I have two answers to that. One is if you go to the site, www.hgap5.com, we have links to every question that's ever been asked on the test, and you can see some of those. That is the short answer. The long answer would be I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about how the test is formatted, what the test looks like, how they do the scoring of the test, just to kind of help you prepare. Because being able to prepare for the test itself is always an important part of being successful. So short answer to that, to your question is, I know there has been a question comparing the von Thunen model to the Burgess model, which I made a kind of a passing reference to last week in being able to compare models. I know that there has been a question on shifting cultivation as an agricultural technique. I know because I graded that one a few years ago. So I know that that's there. So that kind of gets back to looking at types of agriculture and comparing those things to population clusters, comparing those things to climate and those kind of things. And there was a lot of that kind of discussion on the rubric for the test. But since the question has kind of been asked about the test itself and some of the types of questions that have been asked, I thought that was a nice segue to kind of discuss a little bit about the test format and structure. You may already, but I'm going to go over that anyway. One of the unique things that being a reader kind of provides is a little bit of insight into the scoring process and how the grading and stuff works. So let's start with, so one of the questions that I always get from my students is, well, what do I have to get on the multiple choice to get a 4 or 5? And it's simply not that. There is really no magic score. My general rule is you need to be getting 75, 80% on the multiple choice to have a shot at a 4. I'd be there right now, but you still got some time to continue to work on that. And I just say that because there's really no way to compare a traditional 100-point grading scale or an ABC DF scale to what they actually compute on the test. So the multiple choice is 50% of the test. So that is 1/2 of the test. So whatever you get, they put it into a computer, it spits out a number, and then that counts as 0.5 of your grade. The other part of the final grade is the free response. Response basically is, there are 3. They are usually between 5 and 8 or depending on the question. Hopefully you've had a chance to see some of those and see some of the rubrics that are used. They're very specific. So if you've had maybe older siblings or friends that have taken things like AP World or AP European or even AP US, they've got some very, very broad rubrics that they use. Human geography does not do that. It uses a very specific rubric. When we score them, we're basically given a rubric that we are really not allowed to deviate from. And it may have, 4 or 5 or 6 acceptable answers or acceptable choices for each point on the rubric. And some parts are worth 2 points, some parts are worth 1. There may be some where you have to get 1 point to get another. Some of that changes year to year with each question. Some of that changes year to year with how the rubric is interpreted by the chief reader. But basically what happens is we sit around a table, about 10 of us to each look like a long folding table, and we just go through essays and we read sometimes, anywhere from, we read them 25 at a time, and you'll probably get through sometimes 300 or 400 essays in a day. And as we're going, we're kind of calibrating our grading to make it consistent. So there's really no way of knowing exactly how well you need to do on the multiple choice, because the essays or the written portion you just don't know about until the end of the process. Rubrics themselves are written after the test is taken, so a group of graders get together a few days before the rest of us arrive. They look at each question, they determine the rubric, they talk about what are some acceptable options and choices. They pull some test scripts or some samples, and they use those to kind of calibrate the rubric. So it's really impossible to know how well you need to do on X, Y, and Z. All I can say is study hard and try your best. If you've been working hard throughout the year, if you've been studying throughout the year, and you continue to do so, then your odds are much better. If your goal is to cram everything in the next 3 weeks, good luck with that. That may be a less successful solution. But I will do my best to help you with that over the course of the next few weeks. Another thing that you need to know is that the AP score, or the AP test, is a norm reference test. What that means is that there is a particular distribution of scores that ETS and the College Board want to see. And they want to see basically what's called a bell curve or a normal distribution. And that's where there's a bulk of kind of scores in the middle. The idea that most people are going to be in the middle, and very few on the end. So when they put in all of the data into this computer and they spit out the 1 through 5 scores, they do that in order to achieve that or that distribution. So what that means is there's not a lot of 1s, there's not a lot of 5s. There's probably more 2s and 3s, and a few more 4s perhaps, in order to create that bell curve where the largest bulk is in the middle around 2s and 3s. So that is kind of a little bit about the test itself. If you've not had a chance to look at some sample questions, to look at some of those kind of things, I highly recommend that you do that on our site at www.hgap5.com. There's lots available in lots of different places. But if you haven't had a chance to do that, go ahead. You should do that. If your instructor has not set up a practice test for you, a release test, and see how that works, and practice with the actual timing, you might want to ask them if there's any way that they can do that, because that's an important step as well, getting used to the timing of the test, because you think you have more time than you actually do, especially on the writing. And in my writing videos on the site, I talk a lot about about using time and planning time, and things like that are a very important part of that process. But you do not have as much time as you think. I have found that students tend to, there's kind of 2 types of essays. There's the I don't know much, so I'm just gonna kind of ramble a little bit. And then there's some quality essay, and then there's another kind of bad essay, which is the I don't know that much, so I'm just going to brain dump everything on the paper, right? We're going to dump everything out there that we know about this topic. And we are kind of discouraged from giving points. If it's a brain dump, then that really doesn't show that you know it. It just shows that you have some information in your head about this that's related to something that you think might be right, and are just putting it out there. So neither of those scenarios is really good. So trying to really hone in your writing skills between now and the test is very important. Do lots of writing practice. As I said, we have lots of writing practice on the site, and they are available to use. So that is a resource to you. Once again, all of our resources are free. All right, so I think that addresses some of the test-taking strategies themselves. As you get closer to the test, you may have more of those. Please feel free to use those. So a couple other things. I don't know if you guys can see the chat window or not, but the chat window has not worked in the past, but I'm going to try to see if it works. Typing a little message here. I'm a horrible typer, so if I type something, it's very spelled or something like that. I'm going to put that in there, and if you see it, great. If not, then we'll figure something out. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit today about agriculture, not agriculture, that was last week, about economic development and industry. So one of the things that I like to talk to my kids about very early on in the course is why this is, I think, one of the most important courses you could ever take. And why the content in this course is very, very important is, hey, must be pizza time, is that it really helps us understand and explain the real world. So the things that you learn in this course help us to understand some very, very complex relationships and some very complex interactions about the world around us. And they explain, not completely, because there's no way to completely explain it, especially not in one course, but they give us lots of in-depth insight into interactions, right? So, and as we go through the course, and as we get into these last couple of weeks, when we're looking at some very large picture, big picture, macro level analyses of see how those big things are connected to some of the other things that we've talked about, right? So today's discussion is connected very closely to agriculture. It's connected very closely to politics, and we can kind of see some of those interactions as well. So today's topic, development in industry, is really, really important because it helps us answer the question that was famously posed. It's been posed by lots of people. Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Collapse fame. And his question basically is, why are some nations or some groups of people wealthy and some groups of people not? And there's some political explanations for that, which we talked about in the political unit. There's some geographical, physical, some physical, geographical, some climatic answers to that question. But a lot of that question lies in today's topic, which is economic development and industry and types of economic activities. So I want to talk about those things first, and then we'll move a little bit into industry. Industry is I'm going to talk as much about that. There's lots of models, but the models themselves are, I think, are pretty self-explanatory in this particular chapter, but we will get to some of those as we move along. So let's talk about economic activities. How do people make a living? What do people do in order to provide for themselves and provide for their families and their communities, right? We all have to eat. We all need a place to live. We would all like to have access to reasonable health care and basic necessities and things like that. So what do we do to do that? What do we do to create that opportunity for ourselves? I'm sure everybody out there, your parents have jobs or at least have some form of income. If not, then that's I apologize for my assumption, but most people do. So that the understanding those relationships is important. And one of the things that I want to talk about today is there's kind of a progression in societies and economics. There's a progression over time. There's a progression over kind of different stages of these things. But the first thing that I want to talk about is, how do people make money? So last week we talked about agriculture. We talked about the different agricultural revolutions. And agriculture basically remained the same for thousands of years. So today we look at agriculture, especially in the Western world, as a kind of a commercial activity. It's not done for subsistence like it is done in some other parts of the world. But the first kind of level of economic activity includes things like agriculture, mining, forestry and timber, anything that involves extraction, anything that involves taking things out of the ground in raw form. So farming, you're taking grain or rice out of the ground. You're taking ore, you're taking oil or natural gas, you're taking fish out of the ocean, you're cutting down trees. So these kind of extractive things are called primary economic activities. They're the most basic things that people do in order to make a living. Okay. Now, they may do it in a subsistence way where everything that they bring in, they keep, or they may sell those things on the market to other people, right? So one of the things to remember about primary activities, and this is important, is that primary activities, because they are so basic in terms of economic activities, do not require any formal training to do. And when I say formal training, you don't necessarily have to go to school to learn how to do these things. You don't have to go to school to work in a coal mine. And when I say these things, I'm not saying that to diminish these people's efforts and the contributions that they make. Just the opposite. I really want to make sure we understand the importance of their role. But swinging a pickaxe requires a lot of physical strength, a lot of physical endurance, but it does not necessarily require what we would call formal education skills. Okay, and the reason why this is important is if it doesn't require those skills, then a lot more people are able to do it, right? I could go into a coal mine and swing a pickaxe if I had the physical strength and ability to do it. All right. So as long as I have that physical strength and ability to do it, I can't. The reason why this is kind of problematic for people that are involved in primary activity, that means that there's a lot more people that can do it than there probably are jobs to do it, which means that wages will tend to be lower, which means that the people involved in those economic activities may have less negotiation or bartering positions with their employers. Okay. It also means that a lot of times this gets us into some discussion of what we call core periphery relationships. And basically, periphery countries, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, periphery countries' job is to supply these things. They supply resources and raw materials, this complicated economic system. And so that kind of becomes their job. Because they lack some of this negotiating and bartering power, they also end up in a position where they don't have as much power to set the terms of exchange or individual level. And so they end up in some very difficult positions for those who are stuck in these types of jobs. Okay. The next kind of job up, or the next level up, is called secondary. And secondary basically is taking raw materials and transforming them into finished products. So this is where factories get involved. This is where those types of things happen. And this requires skill, or at least very specific training, right? In order to run a machine press, you need to have been trained. You need to have some skills. You need to have some practice in that. And so this actually creates a slightly better or gives secondary type workers slightly more negotiating power, slightly power within the system. They probably get paid a little bit more because, the next step up from that is, well, you have to have some skills, and therefore the pool becomes smaller. All right. We talk about manufacturing. We also talk a lot about the idea of offshoring or outsourcing or things like that. Because while secondary workers and secondary sectors make more than primary do, they still are significantly cheaper in, say, the developing world than they are in the developed world. So paying someone in the United States to be a manufacturer and work in a manufacturing job costs significantly more than it does in, Costa Rica or Guatemala or Bangladesh. And we could talk about the ethics of that, and will, a little bit later. But that's an interesting point to keep in mind when we talk about secondary. Tertiary is kind of the next level up. But tertiary is interesting because tertiary can have different applications for different types of educational attainment. So tertiary basically is service type jobs. So jobs that are not necessarily creating a physical, tangible product. So so customer service jobs. So things that involve you know, waiting tables, that involve being you know, selling like insurance products. Tertiary is kind of the basic level of economic activity in the U.S. today. The largest sector is probably tertiary or service sector. Our manufacturing has greatly diminished, as has our prime, and we rely very heavily on the tertiary sector. The next one is quaternary. Quaternary, once again, does require significantly more formal education. So this is going to be people that basically deal in knowledge-based economies. So, you know, technical people, lawyers, things like that require high levels of formal training. And then, of course, at the end we have the quaternary, which is, you know, very specialized, very specific types of jobs that require very high levels of education. So there's kind of this relationship between wages and power and the types of jobs that you have and your level of educational attainment, right? I work at a very technology-driven school. I work at a school with lots of aspiring engineers. But I also, my kids are like, well, I don't need to go to college. I can do X, Y, and Z. And possibly, but as a geography teacher, I'd like to go back to the fact that every indicator of happiness, every indicator of economics, strength, and success is tied to education. And it is a positive relation. The more education you have, the more successful and happy you tend to be in life and as a society. You may not always continue to earn more, especially when you get to the highest levels. But there's very little data that suggests opting out of education is really beneficial. I mean, you could always point to Bill Gates, but you know, they're the exception, not the rule. Anyway, so there's this relationship between education and these types of economic activities. Okay, so let's go ahead and transition then into this idea of core periphery. So core periphery model or core periphery relationships argues a couple of things. It argues that there are certain parts of the world or certain countries or certain groups of people that access to and control a lot of different types of economic activity. Okay, so for example, the developed world, as we refer to it, so the United States, Western Europe, and some emerging countries in Asia and South America are considered part of the core, but especially the U.S. and Western Europe. And basically, the core has access to education. Core has access to intellectual property like patents and technology. They have access to the most educated people. They have access to capital that is used to build other things. And basically, those things become concentrated in certain places in the hands of certain groups of people. And that is called the core. Okay. The periphery then is designed to supply the core with different things that they need, right? So by choosing to focus on tertiary, quaternary, and quinary types of economic activities in the West, we then make a decision not to focus on primary and secondary, right? So we rely on the periphery to provide us with primary and secondary type industries, right? Someone else does our extraction of resources and we get them. Somebody else does our assembling and manufacturing for us. Those are the jobs of the core and the periphery, right? The core's job is to provide market, is to provide capital, is to provide the access to the system that the periphery then fills in, okay? And so you can also have this kind of middle area called the semi-periphery. And the semi-periphery functions as a core to some areas and a periphery to others. For example, India. India is a good example of a semi-periphery, right? They provide periphery type activities to the U.S. and Western Europe, at least for now. They may start replacing us in one day. They provide periphery type activities to some, but in their region, they are a dominant economic power, and therefore other places act as a periphery to them. So they're kind of in the middle. So the U.S. and Western Europe pretty much always going to be core. Countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan are probably always going to be, not always, but that's kind of their permanent state for now. Are always going to be periphery, and then there's these ones in the middle that kind of function both ways. So think of this as kind of a circular model of, some things go out and some things come in, and some things go out and some things go in, and some things go out. So labor and resources come into the core, capital goes out, capital and jobs and things like that go out. Okay, so that's kind of the way core theoretically works. Now, one of the things that's important in the way that I just described this is I described this in what's called a liberalist model point. And liberalist models assume that economic activity, economic growth, economic improvement is all pretty much within the hands of every country based on the choices and decisions that they make, right? So I just described this as some things come into the core and some things go out of the core. And a very free and open kind of way. Now, that's one model. That's a liberalist model. Rostow, for example, is a really good example of the of a liberalist model. Rostow says, here are all of the different steps necessary that a country has to go through in order for it to go relatively poor to being wealthy. You've got your traditional stage, you've got your preconditions to take off, you've got your takeoff, you've got your mature growth stage, and then you've got your consumptive stage at the end, right? Or mass consumption stage. Rostow would argue that through this, every country makes decisions about their economic policies, about their relationships to their neighbors that allow them to go through these steps, right? Others, however, argue that this core periphery relationship is not a fair and balanced system. They argue that because the core has access to the capital and the educated and the higher levels of education, and that gives them actually power to control the system in ways that benefit them over the periphery, right? And that the ability for periphery countries to improve and to move stages is all based on what the core allows them to do. Okay, these people are called structuralists, right? Structuralists make this argument that the rules of the game are set, and that some countries control those rules and use those results. Okay, part of a structuralist model is called dependency theory. And dependency theory argues that wealthy countries, powerful countries, core countries want to keep periphery countries poor, because they need cheap labor, they need cheap manufacturing, they need access to resources. And if those countries become more developed, if those countries begin to grow economically and become wealthier, then that makes all of those products either one, more for the core, or they have to then replace that country with somebody else. Okay, this is one of the big arguments about or against things like NAFTA, is that eventually Mexico will benefit for a while, grows to a point that it is no longer the cheapest option. Then those countries and those things will move out. Dependency theorists also argue that the majority of the wealth that is developed or that is produced in the periphery ends up back in the core, right? So let's say that I build a oil refinery in Costa Rica. Most of the profits are going to end up back in the U.S. in my pocket. Now, will the people have jobs? Yes. Will those jobs be better than probably a lot of their neighbors? Absolutely, they might be. Still be relatively low wage. Structuralists and dependency theorists argue that core companies and core governments work to prevent the development of of nationalized industries, right? So we will be glad to set up an oil refinery in your country, but you have to promise that you won't let anyone who lives in the country or is a native of the country set up a competing thing, right? And so it ends up limiting the access to them to low-wage workers, to primary and secondary type industries. They rarely develop beyond that, according to a structuralist model. Okay, so those are kind of the two ways to look at it. Rostow says, yes, we start in one place and then move quickly or not quickly through the process based on the decisions that we make. And then a structuralist is going to argue that the system is kind of set and the powerful countries allow things to happen. And I think there's arguments to support both. I think you can look at a lot of cases of primary countries and their consistent underdevelopment and lack of advancement. And very smart and very intentional about their development, and have leveraged that to become some of those semi-periphery type countries. Structuralists would look at India, China, and Brazil and say, well, you know, China's got a massive population, therefore the core was willing to allow them to develop in order to further that relationship. Same thing with India. They speak English, and therefore it's beneficial to set up industries there and allow some advancement there. So even structuralists would have kind of a counter to those kind of semi-periphery examples. So think about that idea that the systems are set. The other thing that is a kind of a structuralist model is what's called world systems theory. There was an essay a few years ago that asked you to compare the two, to compare Rostow and world systems theory, also known as Wallerstein's theory. And so Wallerstein's theory basically is a core periphery structuralist theory. Basically, it says some people, some parts of the world, some regions dominate and others do not. World systems theory argues that over time there's been some shift in what that dominance looks like and who it is. So it was the British for a long time. Before the British, it was the Dutch, and then after the British came the Americans. And so there's kind of been a progression of who that dominant core is. So even Wallerstein has a little bit of some liberalist shifting and moving within those processes. But you know, as a world historian, there's also some structuralist reasons why we could explain that. Okay, so those are some of the economic things you need to know about. Know about those different levels of economic theories. Know about the different types of economic activities, and know how those trade-offs happen. All right. Know some things about the way that gender affects economic development especially in the developing world. So there are geographers out there, and I'm not necessarily opposed to this thought, that basically believe that economic development overall in the big picture is tied to the status of women in a particular society. And that societies in which women is already plural, in which women have more rights and power, see more rapid economic development. Part of this is it creates a larger workforce. Part of this is that it creates a different mindset in the workforce. So one of the interesting trends that's been happening in the last 20 years in the developing world is the idea of microcredit, which is wealthy people, wealthy countries, wealthy banks invest small amounts of money in developing countries, where a small amount of wealthy people money goes a long way, to help them develop, businesses and things like that. One of the really popular groups that does this is a website called Kiva.org. Kiva, basically, you can go on there and you can put in $25, and $25 will help somebody in in Cameroon stock their the shelves of their store for a month, right? So that that exchange rate in difference in economic systems really plays a big deal. What a lot of data has suggested, though, is that the more successful micro lending and microcredit programs lend money to women. And there's all kinds of interesting anecdotal theories about why that is. One is that women are more likely to be more responsible with money. They are more likely to invest it in things that are beneficial to children, things that help the family in the long run. Anyway, so those are some of the theories. So there's some theory that connects economic development to the relative economic status of women in a particular country. I don't know if it is. I don't want to speak to the data that support this, but I think we can see a similar trend in our country, that the post-war economic boom was also tied to kind of the liberalization of gender norms in our country as well. That's an anecdotal statement that is not based on any data that I have. I just thought it was an interesting way to think about our own country as well. Okay, all right. So I want to talk just a little bit about industry, simply because that's an important part of the test. I don't think industry has ever been as important as economic development, although there have been a good number of essays about them. There has been a good number of FRQs about industry. There was one about Weber's model. There was one about the idea of footloose industries. And things like that. So let's briefly talk about the idea of industry. So industry is an important concept in the economic development of a particular country. And there's lots of interesting geographical things that happen when we look at industry. Okay, one of the things that we look at is the relationship between market and how do we maximize that relationship. Let's take a step back before we do that. Let's talk just real quick about the Industrial Revolution. So as we talked last week, for thousands of years, as soon as people stopped hunting and gathering until about the beginning of the 18th century, most people made their money or made their living in agriculture. That began to change in the 18th century. What happened in the 18th century was there became, especially in England, a large number of what we call displaced agricultural workers, and that there was less people that owned farms, and therefore there was less people to work on farms. And what people ended up doing was moving into cities. And what ended up happening was they began to discover that if we take let's take the processes and things that we used to provide for ourselves at home, right? So clothes, for example, or farm implements. Instead of everybody making their own, what if we made them like in large quantities and mass produced them in urban centers where there were lots of people, and you could pay people to come into these buildings and make things, right? So this began this like factory system, and it began the mass production of products, especially consumer products. And this begins, as I said, in the 18th century. Along with this is the discovery of some different ways that we can use machines to make these processes easier. Okay, so we're going to use steam power to supplement animal power in a lot of ways. Okay, we're going to use steam power to supplement human power as well in terms of production. Okay, so we're going to get to a point where we're going to be able to produce large amounts of things, to produce large amounts of products, and we can then sell those products to people, and we can then buy. So this creates this group of people in the middle. We had the poor for thousands of years, but the Industrial Revolution creates this middle group that is basically responsible for managing production and managing the exchange of goods and services, or this idea of this what we call capitalist class, or the manager class, which eventually kind of evolves into what we now think of as the middle class. Now, that's a very recent development, probably in the last 200 years itself, right? So we have this new class of people. We have this new way of doing work, right? A lot of people are now working in factories. They're working in cities as opposed to agricultural labor. They're producing mass quantities of things, right? Styles, I may make 1,000 shirts a day, or I may make 1,000 wagon wheels a day or whatever, right? This mass production. And what people began to realize was that there was a lot of money to be made, especially middle or that upper class. And so we begin to see industry taking over in large scale places. Now, industry is kind of a double-edged sword socially, in that, yes, there's lots of money to be made, but there's also a lot of negatives, especially to people in those lower classes, in terms of the amount of hours they work, the amount of wages that they earn, the safety of factories relative to the profits that can be made. So very early on in industry, there's lots of negatives, especially for the lower classes. Now, over time, this leads those lower classes to kind of use their collective power, the power of the group, to kind of get ones fixed, right? So they, over time, begin to create things like minimum wage laws, and they create organizations to protect worker safety and do all kinds of things like that. And so, you know, in a very general way, over time, we've seen the evolution of industry be very profitable for lots of different groups of people, as opposed to just the top people at the top. Now, there's a lot of difference in the power and wealth amongst those groups within the industrial system. But what ends up happening is industry spreads very rapidly out of England. It spreads to the US, it spreads to France and to Germany, and eventually it ends up in like Russia in the early part of the 20th century. It is still seen as a goal, an economic goal for most countries, is to develop industry, to develop these secondary industries, to develop worker, or this kind of middle class that is no longer living in a subsistence way. All right, so that's kind of some of the history about it. And I could talk all day about the history of industrialization, but I won't do that. But when we look at industry, what happens is there becomes lots of theories and models around how to make these things better. I really encourage you to go back and look at those models. For example, Weber's model. Weber's model talks about the relationship between resources and the market. All right, and in the middle of that is transportation costs. How do we balance those factors together to maximize where we need to put our factories, right? You know, once again, this is location, location, location. And so that, how do we balance those things out? Ullman's model, which is going to argue that there's a zone of profitability, right? There's a sweet spot in which profits are maximized and in which they're not, okay? So go back and look at those models, study those models, be familiar with them as you move forward, okay? I'm not gonna go into a whole lot of details, mainly because the graphics that go along with these models, I think, are very helpful in looking at them physically. The physical graphics that exist on these models and how they work. But it's all about the differences and trade-offs within these different types of things. Okay, so that's about all the time we have today. I did take a little longer on my test discussion than I wanted to, but I hope that was useful information and helpful information. If not, please log in to HGAP5.com and ask some questions so I can be more specific next time, okay? So go back, look at those models, think about those core periphery relationships, think about those different types of economic activities, think about how much of this process is explained by structures, how much of it is explained by choices, and that gives us the trade-off. All right, awesome. Good to see you guys. We'll see you next week when we'll talk about urbanization.